a little bit. Hmm. There's something across the, oh, there, it's gone. Well,
The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the O.R. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, C.O.R.E. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National C.O.R.E. and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Greetings to the viewers of the Dr. Oba Tashaka Show, and I want to greet Sister Robin, Brother Ugawa, Brother Dreamchild, and Ed Donaldson, and Lady K. Mosley, my, husband and wife. You're in for a treat today, a very special program. We've got a great man, a great musician, a great composer, a great intellectual, and freedom fighter. The great jazz saxophonist, of course, he's a saxophonist, who plays tenor, baritone, saxophone, saxello, clarinet, and oboe, and is a master composer in his own right, John Handy. Hey, John, how you doing?
fine, Tashaka. I'm fine. I had to get up early though. I'm up a little early, but it's
yeah,
it's
you
a
know,
place.
musicians like to sleep late at night because they perform at that time, so their body clocks are probably not wired the way most people's
No,
body clocks are wired. You know what I mean? So I really
I'm
appreciate that you've taken this time here to share with our viewers a lot about you, the music, and our culture and our history. So
okay.
it's a real pleasure, John. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate this.
It's mine too, so it's definitely mine to get to talk with you. I'm a chronic insomniac, so not much sleep. I don't sleep a lot, so I'm in bed, but I don't sleep a lot.
Okay.
It's so if I fall asleep, I just hear me snoring. It's I will stay awake for the interview.
he's talking trash here because this ain't hardly what's going to be happening. And also greetings to your lovely wife, Dr. Dell Anderson, Handy, who I had the chance to do some exchange with right now and before, a Mississippi lady. And jazz musicians in addition to having a strong sense, and musicians in general, a strong sense of art, they have a real appreciation of ladies. And John definitely knows a good one when he sees one, and he's got a great wife. Am I telling the truth, John?
You're telling the truth. She was a fashion model before, before she became an educator. So yeah, I have a
Oh,
pretty good eye. Of,
oh, I didn't know that part.
well, you didn't know that part. She was a model with the Ebony Fashion Fair.
Okay,
Yep,
right
an
on,
early, yeah. So
right on. Yeah, in
yeah,
fact, my first wife was a model too. You know what I mean? So I guess
oh,
we have some complementary taste. And then my
yeah.
current wife, my lovely wife, Pam Hurley Tashaka, she went to the Fashion School of Design in New York, and she's a walking fashion plate.
Oh my,
And she's lovely, both in appearance and in character. So,
I,
gotta have you a good woman. You know what I mean?
I, right. I remember, we met her. I met her at your birthday, last birth. I think it was your last
Yeah,
birthday.
right. My 80th
Yeah.
birthday party. Yeah.
Uh,
hmm Yeah. So for viewers, this show's dedicated to the theme of African American culture, the popular and classical culture of the United States and the world. So today we got this special privilege of having John Handy, a master of the highest realm of the culture, which is the art form. Our ancestors created both a culture here and an art form. And the European imported his from Europe. He doesn't have anything indigenous to this place. And so Brother John Handy is a representative of the highest realm of of African American culture, its art form, and the highest realm of the art form, which is jazz or classical music, which is the art form of the United States and the world, our whole art form. And then jazz is the classical art form of the United States and the world. And that's no small statement. So, what you got here, when you're dealing with a great musician like John Handy, you don't just have a musical player, you got a thinker. And you're going to find out a deep thinker. John and I go back to the San Francisco Freedom Movement, where I first met you, and we'll
mhm,
get into that later. So, John,
mhm.
could you give the viewers a background on who you are, where you were born, your parents, your siblings, and where you went to high school?
Oh, okay. Well, I was born in in Dallas, Texas, in 1933, uh, February 3rd. I I s- my parents were very young, and in some ways, kind of grew up with them. They were John, and I'm named after my father, John Richard Handy. The first, I'm the I'm the third actually. He was the second, and I have a son who was a drummer who played with me for a while, and he's the fourth. Um, I went to I started school rather late. I had a younger sister, so I babysat her for close to 2 years, but and she was late starting to school. So I actually started. Um, I was 8.5 years old when I started the first grade. I started for a minute at 6, but I didn't go. I only stayed there for a very short while, and so I I went to JWA school. That was the name of the grammar school in Dallas, in North Dallas. And at the time, or during most of my first 15 years on the planet, we lived mostly in Caucasian districts, almost exclusively, and we weren't integrated. So that's I we had to we had to commute to school, grammar school, first through the first 2 years. Moved to LA for a minute during World War II, and stayed there for a very short while. But I really enjoyed the 6 months or so that we were there. Back to Dallas, And it was the first time since I was a very young, too young to even know much. I couldn't go by myself. I was, uh, we were in the African American community, and I was going to an uh, all African American grammar school where my mom and father had gone and where they had met the kids. And uh, in a short while, the next 5 years, excuse me, the next next almost 5 years, we went to school in North Dallas, which to St. Peter's Academy, my sister and I, that is. And I started there. This is kind of interesting. When we moved to LA, I'll jump this further. I've been in this music, um, in music for as a professional for over 73 years. So a lot of things have come and gone. So I'll backtrack on occasion because by the way, I had a fairly recent stroke, and sometimes I kind of forget. And you know, and I'm almost 89. I'm almost 89 years old. So, am I? Yeah, I'm almost 89. Yeah.
Yeah, you're
Um,
doing fine.
yeah. uh, I'm coming and I'll come and go, uh, depending on where my brain takes me. Um, Back to Dallas, and so I went to NW Harley Grammar School for a minute, and then we finished the semester there, and then we went to St. Peter's Academy, which is a Catholic school, my sister and I. And I really, I'll put it this way too. We left Dallas, going back again for a minute. We left Dallas, and I had just finished the second grade. We were in LA, Los Angeles for 6 months. And I came back to Dallas. I was in the fifth grade within 6 months. So I through school rather fast. Um, I wanted to be a carpenter as a little kid. I thought I did. I used to carve. I cut my hands a little bit, a few times, and I drew and did a little bit of painting before I got into music. I was attracted to music, but we had no music. We didn't have musicians. We didn't have instruments, and so when I jumped way ahead, jumping ahead, I was 13 for about 3 years. I was 13 years old, and we discovered a clarinet that some neighbors at a neighbor's next door neighbors at their store. My mother bought it for me, and that's when I started playing. 13 years old, and well, it was a surprise because I'd wanted it and she didn't get it right away. However, I was in school and something said, "You go home early today. Don't hang out at school. Uh, your clarinet is there." And when I went home, my sister was already there. And when I walked in, I said, "Where's my clarinet?" And nobody had told me anything. I just knew it was there. And they looked at each other too, like, well, we don't know. What are you talking about? I reached under the bed that was in the living room, and the clarinet was there. And so I picked it up, and tried to play it. I played some recorders, by the way, and I went to school the next day with it, and I had the mouthpiece on upside down. I didn't. Somebody told me they showed me that it was the proper way to how to place it on the clarinet. So anyhow, I went home early that day, and my mom would come home about 2.5 to 3 hours later. When she got there, uh, I had made a few squeaks, but after I got home, my mom came home about 3 hours later. I could play almost anything I'd ever heard on clarinet.
Gotta be kidding.
Yeah, yeah.
Gotta
And
be kidding.
I played piccolo. I played recorders,
Mhm.
plastic little things, toys, but the fingering was somewhat familiar, and I could if I knew something, I could play, not complicated stuff, but radio songs that were on the radio, and I could play the ballads. Yes, I could do that.
Mm,
And
wow.
yeah, so yeah. So then I went to school the next day, and here we were. I was the only boy in the clarinet section, and I couldn't read music, and so the instructor gave me the names of some books to get, and I got the books. And the next week, I started from the first chair, the last chair, and we had two high school girls who were, juniors and seniors in high school. I was a sixth grader, and at the end of the session, I taught myself how to read, by the way. And I feel anybody can teach themselves how to read music if they can count the change of $1. So I learned so I learned to read. I was reading the parts. I went from the last chair to the first chair. I was ahead of the two high school girls, and
Mm,
first chair from the beginning, from there on.
mm,
So,
mm.
yeah.
Wow.
hmm
So that
And
explains how the clarinet became one of the instruments you play.
yeah.
And you just apparently have a natural talent for this, you know?
Well, I guess so. I just sort of understood it because and as I said, first I wanted to actually be a painter, but after the clarinet came, I didn't do anything for a lot of years until I was a young adult. If, uh, I did some drawings many years later, in my early
Mm,
30s. So here, I started playing there in Dallas, and we moved. We moved back to California, and it was almost immediately after I was here. I was 15 years old, and I found out I could borrow a saxophone from McClymonds High School, where a bunch of athletes and musicians went. I borrowed the saxophone on Wednesday. I played the first gig Saturday. So I never stopped, and within within 3 or 4 months, I was playing with some of the best musicians in jazz.
wow.
Started going to jam sessions in San Francisco at a place called Bob City. So uh, when I finished high school, I met Coltrane that year. He was playing here with Johnny Hodges, as a matter of fact. Johnny Hodges had a new record, and he played with him. So I met him there when he was with Johnny Hodges, and people like that. Frank Foster, who used to come to Bob City, and he came quite often. He was in the military, and so I would learn to jam with him and a bunch of fantastic people here, like the wild man Sandy Willis, who was 12, a young adult, and he loved to play things in very unusual, difficult keys. I played a lot of rhythm and blues with quite a bit. I always wanted to play jazz, and it was like 50% between the two. Short thereafter, we went to Cleveland, Ohio, when I was 17, and I went to Central High School there for 3.5 months, and I became very close friends with the late Bill Hardman. We were seniors in high school, trumpet player, and what I learned from him was Bill could play all the changes of tunes on the piano, and I learned how to voice chords uh, by watching Bill, and so that's he helped me in that way by just listening and watching, learning, and I was back to San Francisco, back to Oakland, uh, and playing the gigs. One of my best friends, who was Henry Browning, and we continued our friendship. And high school, I finished high school. He didn't. And I was very disappointed in that. But he was a big guy and very smart, very talented. And we started talking about the piano. There were other musicians here who were older, and there was some of the most talented musicians I've ever met and heard play were in Oakland, but they were frustrated because there was no outlet. virtually none. Then I moved to San Francisco to go to San Francisco State University, but later university.
Hold on there. Let's go back a little bit because when we were talking before, you told me about your interaction with Coltrane and how he talked to you and influenced you. You want to just explain that a little bit?
Well, this is the second time I met Coltrane when I was right out of high school, and I couldn't actually hang out very much. We just, as a matter of fact, there's a book out that is released, and it's entitled Harlem of the West, and there's a picture of 4 musicians on there. Left to right is myself when I was 18. Next is Pawnee Poindexter, the saxophone player, who's playing. Next to him is John Coltrane, and before he was John Coltrane, he was, and before he was the name, and then Frank Fisher. That the pictures on this book, on the cover of the book, and then the way I got to know John later, he came here with Miles Davis the next time, and that was, well, when did I get out of high school? 18 something, 15, 1951, and he came back with Miles after I'd been discharged from the military, and that's when I hung out. We hung out a bit together. He came to my house, and as a matter of fact, he came to my 23rd birthday party along with Paul Chambers, Philly Joe Jones, and they were all in Miles' band. Miles didn't come, and Paul Chambers, did I say that? Bass player, Philly Joe Jones, drummer, and John Coltrane. So something that's significant that I saw, it was in Coltrane's hotel room. I'd gone in to get him to. We were going to hang out, and there was a note with written on a sheet of music. It was Stablemates. It was Benny Golson's song, and he had asked. There was a note on it asking Miles Davis if he might find it some place that he might want to, if he would record it or play it, So that was kind of interesting. I heard from Benny Golson, although I'd met him earlier than I did John, and he was with Earl Bostic, as a matter of fact. When he came through here, and he said something about a name for certain scales. I didn't really know much about theory. I remembered him referring to the double diminished. I got that from Benny Golson, and I think I understood it. Yeah, Benny Golson. Yeah. So that was it. I started to.
So was there anything that Coltrane said to you? Because before you said that he had done some encouragement or something when he talked to you. Was there something in that?
Okay, yeah. We went to several jam sessions, and I remembered I was with Richard Williams lived here. He was nearby. He was in the Air Force actually, but he was here at the Pop City, the After Hours Club, almost every night that I went there. I wasn't there every night, but we were. John Coltrane and I practiced a bit. I played tenor. I got out of the military, and I was encouraged by some of the more mature musicians who play tenor. They liked my tenor playing, and so I was playing tenor saxophone when John was, when he was with Miles. So we hung out. We went to a jam session, and by the way, Richard Williams was a trumpet player. We had already met the rhythm section, Red Garland, Paul Chambers, and Philly Joe Jones. I remember meeting them at some, it was an after hours place, and they asked us what we wanted to play, and we said Cherokee, and I kind of looked at each other and said, oh yeah. So anyhow, we could play. Yeah, we could play. Then we were at the more popular place called Bop City, and I sat in, and John didn't have his horn. He didn't play. Sonny King, who was the son of a well-known blues composer, Saunders King, singer. I am Sonny King was playing alto, and we had gone to high school together. And for some reason, I borrowed his alto. Well, John Coltrane sat at a table and held my tenor. And when I came back, he said, "That's your horn." Well, I always liked the tenor better than I was just, I liked the tenor a little better than the alto. It fit my body size. I was a little bit small, I thought, for the tenor, but I did like playing it. So that's how I started. I was playing almost exclusively. I owned a tenor saxophone. I didn't even own an alto for 3 years until I went to New York, and I started playing both again. And soon thereafter,
Now, John, one of our viewers here has an interesting observation, and I think it would help because this show also reaches a lot of young people that they'd appreciate this, Brother Dreamchild. He's making the point that jazz represents an aspect of our culture where older masters, in this case musicians, play a role in the development of younger musicians. Could you talk a little bit about that?
well, I'm not young anymore, so I'm 89 years old. I haven't been young for a long time. I have to be. I'm honest. I taught a lot when I was very under, starting at about 19, 20 years old. I taught privately. I used to help
But
musicians
you
for.
know, in your career as a younger musician, because you were talking about Coltrane and others, and that seems to reproduce what happens with a lot of younger musicians. Could you talk about how older masters have influenced or the role of older masters helping to develop younger musicians?
Well, it's yes. I'll try to remember because that long ago when I first got help, it was I'm talking about 1949 and 50, and so that's a long time ago for me to recall. I didn't get private lessons until I was 18 years old, and I had a job in addition uh, to playing music. I worked at the post office and the Naval Supply Center for less than a year and a half, and those are the last and only day gigs I've had as an adult. But we musicians at the time, I played with almost all of the people that I played with were older and more mature. That was a benefit because yes, of course they were more mature, and I learned mostly from actually with kids my age. My best friend and I was 3 months older than he, and we talked about changes, learning how to play the, uh, uh, learning how to play the enough on the enough piano that we could play scales and chords. And I taught myself, to be honest, and the academics of music. I also went to I forget this sometimes. For only about 2 weeks. I went to a conservatory, Candell, here in Oakland, for just a minute. And while I was ninth, 10th grade, 11th grade, and after and went to Cleveland for a minute, and I was back here and back in Oakland after three months, and that's where I met Bill Hartman. And it was so damn cold. I was in the house the 3 months that I was in. I was never outside except to go to my little job for a minute. And I went to one jam session while I was there, and I could always pretty much play. Bill Hartman was good. He could play anything too, uh, and he knew chords. I didn't. I knew some chords, but I didn't know scales. I didn't know how they related. I played when I.
Explain to people who don't know music what a chord is.
Okay, a chord is basically made up of, and it's a European approach to playing the keyboard, the piano, and chords, it can be as small as 3 notes. And for instance, if you know the scale of C, C, D, E, F, G up to C, uh, it's the first note. If you wanted to play a C chord, you'd start on the first note of C. You'd skip D and go to E. So then you'd play C and E. Then you'd skip F and go. You'd play with the fifth, like 1, 2, 3. C, D, E, F, G. So you would play C, E, and G. That's the simplest chord, a triad as we call it. So get yourself some help to understand. I can't tell you all of this in one
Yeah, right.
session, but you have
Just
to
as
do
the introduction.
you get it. No matter what your instrument is, vocals, singers would definitely, like everybody else, learn something about music. Try learn something about the piano, because most of our playing, jazz, classical music, symphonic music, classical music, almost everything relates to the piano keyboard, except, if you can play something like Indian music, you play, it's a different concept. They don't think of harmony as such with scales, and well, they have scales, but they don't think of harmony as with chords. Then, of course, if the chords get larger, you can play C, D, C, E, G. If you want to play a six, you add the A to it, or add B. That's a major seventh, and on up to a ninth, and you can go up to as far as high as a 13th. And then the notes start to repeat themselves. Get yourself a scale book. I very bought a very basic book. I borrowed it actually from the library before I went to Cleveland. And I later bought it. And the real truth of the matter, my learning how to understand, learning to understand chords and scales, and how to build chords with the skills that are available. I got a book, and I taught myself. I never went beyond the first 22 pages of of this book, and it was Harmony for Beginners, Preston Ware Orem, O-R-E-M, and I recommend that book. I did. They had at the end of each chapter they had exercises, and I would do sometimes as many as 4 and 5 exercises, 4 to 5 times, and that's how I learned how scales are put together. The book is very good for that. You learn how to build any scale, no matter what it is or what kind of scale, and all kinds of chords. And most of mine, everything like that, I pretty much did it myself, learned it myself academically.
Just John, going back a little bit, because you're used to back and forth as a creative person. When you were at McClymonds High School, you had a classmate by the name of Bill Russell. Could you make a little bit of comment on that?
He was actually not in my class. I met him. I met Bill after less than 2 weeks here in Oakland, and I went to a recreation center early in the morning on Saturday, and there was nobody there, and I went to a school where we had only one basketball, I don't know what you call it, a court. And there were about 6 nets up in this, and I was by myself, and so I was having it okay by myself, and soon after a while I heard another basketball bouncing, and I looked around. There was this tall, thin kid, and I think he would look to be about 6'2", 6'3" then. I'm 5'7", somewhere in there, and we after a while decided to play each other, and I beat him. I actually beat him. I was a very good athlete. I mean, I had good balance and all that coordination, and I won the first game. But we played 15 games, and I never touched the ball again. I never touched the ball after the first game, and I'd see him. I'd see him from time to time. In a relatively small school, and we finally had when I was a senior. I'm a year older. We're both Aquarians. I moved to Cleveland, so I didn't. We had that's right. Wait a minute. We had a chemistry class we were enrolled in the same, but I was only here for a very short while in that class and moved to Cleveland. That was 1950. So I only saw him again when I came back periodically, in school. And he never played first string, as I recall. I never saw him play in a game. We had another guy who was left-handed and shorter, and so I knew Bill. We saw each other on occasion, but I didn't see him again until I moved to San Francisco, and I was in San Francisco State College, and he was at the University of San Francisco, and just it was a happenstance that he came to a candy store that was like a few steps from my house, and I was looking in the counter to see what they had, and I saw these large feet, and I looked up. Bill Russell had seemed to have grown about 6 or 7 inches since high school. So we spoke, and he was at the University of San Francisco, and so that I didn't see him again until the next time that was years and years later. He came in a club that I was playing in San Francisco with Will Chamberlain, and they filled the room up, just the two of them. They were huge men. So
now, the reason I brought him up is not just because he was the great basketball player, but also because McClymonds, that you went to for a while, is a stand-up, very important black high school in Oakland that produced a whole lot of great black people, and he was one of them. And the other reason was that he made a comment that his playing of basketball was like an art form because he had developed a special art of getting under the basket, grabbing the ball and either holding on to it or automatically passing it to one of his players. And he said, when you introduce something new and you do it well, that's kind of like an art form. And what I would say is, as a basketball player, he was a jazz basketball player because, one, he put the team first. His mastery was at such a high level, no one's ever going to repeat his record. 11 out of 13 years, champions. Nobody's going to do that.
It helps to be 6'10" too.
Yeah. Until Wilt Chamberlain came along and was bigger, but he would continue. His team would outbeat him, because he also submerged his ego into the larger playing. But I would say that he was a deep thinker, and that reflected the jazz within him. Now I want to go to something else with you, because you're not only a master player, but you've also and you learned on your own in the beginning, and then you knew some masters and stuff, and you could play very quickly. But then you decided to go to the university, the same one that I went to, San Francisco State. And you taught in music at Black Studies for a while there as well. But you went there and you took up a degree in music and composing. And so could you talk about the skills that you acquired through that and how it worked with your musicianship as well?
Okay. Well, what happened is, by the time I went to San Francisco State, I was 19 years old, and I had been playing professionally since I was 15, actually, not quite 16. Okay. And I continued to play there, and for only another year. And as I said, I was a resident there in San Francisco. And I learned, I met and continued to learn and play with mainly Bob City, because San Francisco State was no haven for jazz then. And I had to play classical clarinet. I had clarinet lessons as a classical, I had to play within that genre. And so I learned quite a bit by taking those lessons. I later had private lessons, and you had to play the instrument in a different way. And that's why I recommend that when you to go to school, if you can afford private lessons, which I didn't, they were not available for me. and learn as much as you can about music, about the history. If you're going to play jazz, learn something about that. If you're going to play classical music, get the lessons that you understand, so you can learn to articulate the music, play it in the right style, and everybody learns. I learned a lot by taking the clarinet lessons, and that's how I was able to play some of the high notes because I played clarinet first as a clarinet player. I also I took all kinds of classes later, brass classes where you played French horn, tuba, trombone. I learned to play on those, all the strings of bass, viola, cello, and violin. I had to learn. I did all of those, and I learned to compose. And well, I mean, because of my learning at a very young age, I didn't take early the basic theory classes because I passed comprehensive exams on them. I knew enough by learning to play on jazz tunes and could learn how music was put together, songs were put together. So that's one of the ways I learned early uh, about. And some kids are learning in the grammar school here about chords and scales and composing. They learn the the basics for those, and from there you grow and learn how to imitate, and then learn to create. So many people think you come on with something, you learn to play, you start playing something original. You don't most of the time. Some people try that, but generally they're not very good. You have
Now, you've introduced something I had later, but that's fine. So you're describing a process in which jazz musicians, but generally people in all realms learn, and it's a three-level process: imitation, improvisation, innovation. Could you go
yeah.
into that learning thing and why each one of those is important?
Well, yeah, first of all, if you're going to play an instrument, yeah, you get the instrument, and everybody needs to learn something about the piano because because of our skills and skilled approach uh, uh, chordal approach to playing, learning how what chords represent as a sound, as scales, and how to put them together. I think every musician will should be able to compose because if you do those things, you learn of all the theory and harmony. You must be a complete musician. As a singer, too, singers get away with there's so much they don't know and don't learn, and it's really kind of pitiful because and I hear them say, "I'm a songwriter." It's most of that composing is on such a low level. It's almost embarrassing if they knew better. Get some education musically and learn what the hell's going on, about. And that way you can, if you learn how to read, of course, learn how to read music, and you can explore other people's music and learn from that, not
Now,
only
you had
your own.
made the point when you started that discussion that you have to start imitation first. Why does it start first, imitation?
Well, because it's like when we were youngsters, when we are babies, we learn to speak because when we hear parents and other folk and uh, children were already, articulate in that language. No, you learn to speak. You learn how to speak correctly. You do baby talk until you mature more. You learn more. You do the same with music. You
Mhm,
develop that way.
mhm,
Yes.
mhm.
Hmm. And so I'm sorry to put on, criticize singers, but they know what I'm talking about.
So,
Yeah,
so imitation, because you made the point that you start with imitation. You're not going to start with something original first because you've got to get the fundamentals down. You got to learn the fundamentals.
yeah. You learn. You start to learn in your mind's eye. But some people some people don't have that the talent, the intelligence, musical intelligence to be great. Some people don't have what they call an ear, I guess. But you won't know it until you try imitating. And
Mm.
if you that's what you can if you can copy something, get something simple. Don't try and play a Coltrane solo. Don't try to start with Jimmy steps or Dizzy Atmosphere or something like that that Dizzy wrote or Bud Powell. Start with some of theirs, but do some things like Now's the Time. I could play those solos, and I still remember learning those. I started to like Louis Jordan before I knew about Charlie Parker, and I was listening to Charlie Parker when I was 8 years old with Hootie Blues, the Jay McShann band. I remember the solos. I was listening and didn't know who it was, but I was listening to Louis Jordan and his singing, and Perry Como, Frank Sinatra, and lots of people like that. Those were Nat King Cole and blues singers. I knew a bit about them. I heard a lot of their music. I heard much radio as a child because we lived almost all of my first 15 years in Dallas in white districts, as we said, and we weren't integrated. But there was the radio, and that was my communication outside of.
So one of the things you're stressing, and I think this applies to all areas, not just music, that when you're learning something, in this case, music, you're learning the fundamentals through imitation, and it follows a natural learning curve of the way a baby learns from their mother. And you learn the simple stuff first, because it's like building a house. You got to have the foundation. If you don't get the foundation together, then everything else is going to collapse. And your critique of singers, some singers, just because they can naturally sing, some of them don't find it necessary, they think, to know music notes and other aspects of music and the art of composing and all that. And you're saying that strengthens your art as a singer.
What singers do sometimes is they will sometimes take voice lessons. They will learn to produce a nice sound of their voices, but they are ignorant of music. They don't know how it's put together, and they're at the last word I need. They're at the only can get help with their accompanist. In general, it's a piano player, a guitar player, and with the musicians, they can never correct or compose or suggest they can suggest very little. Just intuitively, they need to learn harmony and theory. And some of the younger people are doing that. I can hear what they're on recordings that some are learning very thoroughly, and that's important. And they're becoming better at what they're doing. They're becoming better singers and composers.
Yeah, someone like Alicia Keys, who's a composer, a pianist, and a hell of a singer, she's at nobody's mercy. And so as a result, she's a complete package. And so she's constantly coming up with new stuff. Whereas if you don't have those skills, you're dependent on someone else for the music and whatever comes along that might work and might get you a hit. But she's just a self-contained music world because she's a complete artist,
Exactly. Yeah, that's the idea. Yeah. Sarah Vaughan was a pianist. Carmen McRae, Aretha Franklin. I heard Aretha showed up in a club where I was playing in New York, and she played there. I wasn't playing at the time, but it was the Jazz Gallery, I believe. And she showed up she had a trio. She was a pianist, and she didn't sing a note. I never doing all these things that she was a jazz piano player. And Stevie Wonder's can play the piano. He's a composer. These are extraordinary talents. But most of the others there's a lot of talent. They're great voices. But Nat King Cole, good example, fantastic musician, and a piano player, as well as a great singer. So anyhow, I don't want to put people
So also, you said it goes from imitation, and then the other curve is improvisation, and then innovation. Could you talk a little bit about those other two in terms of acquiring mastery?
Well, time it plays an element here, and exposing yourself yourself to creative musicians. You know, one of the problems that we have is I think, in our American listeners, even more than maybe in some other places, in like Europe and some other countries, Japan, etc., that we we start learning at a very, in a very at a very young age in grammar school, and some of the music does the music itself, and especially much of the popular music hasn't grown that much. By the time people are young adults, it's just a very small the lyrics change because most of it is vocal, and a lot of us haven't do not grow with music. I mean, I'm referring to the general public, and that's how some singers are able to acquire hit songs because the audience hasn't matured musically. It's only almost the same subject, baby daddy. I love you, you know.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. So you're saying that you've got to grow and grow into it. And so, what's that process in terms of improvisation and developing the improvisational thing? What's involved in that in terms of the learning?
well, one of the things you want to learn as much as you can about theory. The more you know about theory, the more sophisticated your listening and your performance and your composing becomes. Your imagination. Your the more you learn about what your skill about your art form, uh, the more apt that you will probably um, uh, learn things that on a higher and more mature level, different levels. Learn about other music cultures. I've done that. I've played a lot with people from uh, uh, India, a lot of them, Ali Akbar Khan, Ravi Shankar. I've toured with them and recorded with them. Um, Classical music, many times the classical players. When I came through, there was hardly a saxophone major when I was a young person. You had to play clarinet, flute, oboe, or a bassoon as a major. But again, I would really stress that you, no matter what your instrument is, learn the piano keyboard, because in the Western world, we refer pretty much to the piano keyboard, the harmonies and almost all the songs, whether they're jazz songs uh, or yeah, religious songs. We've got powerful religious people because of the African attitude toward creativity is involved in jazz, and I don't love the word because of the connotation, the earlier connotation, but it's okay. I'm not jazz. I can use it. Doesn't bother me to use the word on occasion. uh, let's see. I'm kind of running out of
Yeah.
air here.
Jazz has a natural learning curve in terms of the imitation and then bringing together different styles into your own sound, and innovation, the few that want to go on and create new schools that are very few. But
Okay.
the point is, your point is, this is natural. And I want to add, this is one of the things we brought from Africa, because this system is the same system of mastery found in all African mastery systems, those
Okay.
three levels, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very different from the European, which is just teaching you technique, but there's no levels of development, no way of taking people to a higher level.
Well, there are people, the Europeans they have people who are not, lots of amateurs, and even, you could put them on a professional level depending on if they're playing for money, if they're playing for an audience. However, uh, most of our Europeans were, for, they they weren't always before they invented the system of harmony and reading, reading notes, music notation. There was lots of improvisation. That was playing songs, simple songs, and the Euro- the Europeans had pretty much the same kind of uh, setting as far as uh, to play or to be creative, but they invented the music concept of music notation, and somehow it evolved that if they were we became almost slaves of the written note, only
Mm,
it had to play what the composer wrote, and
mhm,
it went to the point that the Europeans started to read music almost to the uh, neglect of learning how to uh, learning to develop the creative mind, and that's where we come in as African Americans. We've taught them, and they've taught themselves to a point, and we've learned. Some of us are learning, and some of other people are learning, um, and internationally from because of that concept. They've learned that they have lots of sources to to learn from. You don't have to just learn to read CEG music notation. You can learn to create even more advanced and more uh, 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 more difficult, if you will, more complicated uh, kinds of compositions, songs, and and compositions, meaning to me, songs without words necessarily. And singing is great. I love good singing. There are great voices, but ignorance is another thing without learning what music is. And some of them are intuitive, and some of the singers are great. They just have to learn something. They need to learn something. They'd be
Now, now
greater.
you now you've made a very profound point right here. One, you made a comment earlier about how we've been drawing the African American from African creativity, a natural thing, and I would say we've taken it to another level.
Many.
And then you make the point that while there was a period in Europe where there was some improvisation, and by the way, I'm preparing a new book on history that explains why that was. I'm not going to go into it, but there's some
Mhm.
reasons why there was a creative period for them. You know nothing about that in their history. But here's the key point you made that what happened is they began to put things in writing. Notation became almost like an enslavement system because you had to play the way the master played. And that's generally how classical music defines greatness. Do you sound like Beethoven or Mozart rather than
Mhm.
you being one yourself? Now, here's the key thing I would make on that the reason, and this is why jazz, blues, all of our art forms, but our culture in general is creative. The European at some point restricted themselves to the analytic mind, period. Logic, and in the teaching, dropping facts on you. And in this particular case, it's dropping notes on you. In this particular case, it's sounding like somebody else, which for us might be in the beginning, imitation. But that's
Mhm.
their whole thing. So for us, what we've done, because we brought the African thing in here, we never separated the spiritual from the material, the sacred from the secular. The spirituals were always about political stuff. They were about freedom. It was about everyday stuff. The blues, the same thing. Jazz, the same thing. And so as a result, when you've got both the spirit and mind working together, then that's creativity. And your point about being confined to the note, like you know how to read music, but you're not
Mhm.
limited to that. And
Right.
somebody who wanted to record Coltrane would be in trouble because Coltrane was always going somewhere else. It's kind of like trying to figure out how were the pyramids built. You know what I mean? They think
Yeah.
they figured it out. No, they haven't. And it wasn't built with concrete. So that
Yeah.
profound thing you're saying there, that's at the depth of our culture, our creativity. And it's the fusion of the masculine and the feminine, of the emotion and the reason, of the intuition and logic. We form them together. Dizzy embodied that. You embody that. Coltrane embodied that. Monk embodied that. Malcolm embodied that. You know what I mean? That's the
Well,
heart of the culture. That's
we,
the
we
core.
African Americans are improvise a day every day that we live. With
T.
most of our, we never know what the heck we're with, how where our life is, where activity is going to take us each day. It's all every day is a little bit different, and
T.
sometimes quite different. Yeah,
T.
we improvise through life, period, especially in this culture.
Well
Yeah,
put. Well
yeah.
put. I always say the hardest thing to produce for Black people by Black people is what we're going to do. We can't predict it.
You can predict nothing. You can predict very little, and even you never know. Even with your day job, it's because of the how we're here, in this situation. Uh, you're not sure about the job. You're not sure whether you're going to be promoted
Yeah.
or hired, or hired, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, but we are improvising every day and continually, and sometimes I don't think we realize that, because many of the poor people, and that's kind of, you'll find that in general, I guess. I've been to been in India, and see that you pretty much the people who are wealthy can predict pretty much their day, what they're going to do, what their activity will be. But with the poor folk, boy, do they have a lot of. I've never seen.
Mm-hmm.
I've never seen
Mm-hmm.
like that in America. And we're working on it very fast. And
Mm-hmm.
there, you know, it even makes some of the people in Korea, when I was a soldier over there, during after the war, it makes them look almost wealthy compared to how some people are born in places like India, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, in poverty, and living on the street. And that's, even in some cases, they're doing still seem to be doing better than the ones on the outskirts of the townships. I've never been in the country, in the rural parts, but
Yeah, because the poorest people, they have a saying in Jamaica that the creativity comes from the dirt. The poorest people are usually the ones who are the greatest creators. Look at the blues, look at the spiritual, look at the whole art form. It came out of hell. And then beauty is what comes out of that. You know what I mean?
uh,
Yeah.
somewhere,
You know what I mean? Yeah.
yeah,
Well put. And your
yeah,
point about we take this for granted too much because it's
yeah.
such a normal feature of how we get by that we just
Mhm.
think that, well, that's matter of fact. Martin Luther King was saying that about the Southern Freedom Movement. Oh, we creatively came up with a way to win. Oh, that's not an O. That's a big achievement. But it was something
Um,
he more or less took for granted. It was a great achievement. It was humility on his part. But don't
mhm.
underestimate your greatest hole card creativity.
That's right.
Creativity.
I first, Martin Luther King. I first became I first went to in New York to one of his lectures. So he was at NYU, which was just up the street from the jazz club, the Five Spot, and it was there that he was about close to 4 years older than I, and I felt guilty that he was uh, presenting himself, and who where he could actually be harmed, even killed at any moment. And that's who actually inspired me to start, involving myself with the civil rights movement in New York. And some of the places that I started to get involved with was Woolworths. Is that right? Yeah, and some of the Broadway hits, Broadway musical, and then later I moved back to California, and then that's where you and I met at C.O.R.E.
Yeah.
And
Let's start there. So you're saying that what got you involved in the freedom movement, the Black freedom movement, was your response to King.
okay,
And
but the response was, wait a minute, the response was to the kids, the young people who are younger than I was in my early 20s, early mid 20s. And at the kids at the counters, you remember the lunch?
Right.
Yeah, I was in New York when that was happening, and I wanted, I wasn't involved. There were mostly music and musicians, and we weren't necessarily thinking uh, that way, to pick it or whatever. And uh, so it wasn't until I was doing it pretty much on my own until I came here, and I met, you and at people at C.O.R.E, Norman Williams, and a number of other folk,
Norman
and
Brown.
Norman Brown. Thank you. I said
Oh.
Norman Brown.
Mhm.
Yeah, Norman, and who, by the way, is I think he told me I think as I recall, or I think I remember him as saying he came to the jazz. He might have even seen me, I believe he said, and at the Five Spot. He, Norman went to hear.
Probably so. Norman's everywhere. Uh, so talk a little bit about your involvement in the San Francisco Freedom Movement. For people that don't know, John Handy was one of the leaders in the movement and led our Freedom Band, but was
Yeah.
active in the movement in various ways. Talk a little bit about that and what you saw of the San Francisco Freedom Movement. What did you see it accomplishing?
You were a young fellow there, and I think were you in law school then, or had
Right.
just come?
Yeah.
Yeah, you were pursuing for a while, I think, for maybe before a career in law, and so my wife and I started coming there. I was after being inspired by New York. We both had lived in New York, and as I said, so I started coming to the meetings, and we were involved in things that I agreed that where there was segregation, started picketing because we didn't agree with what they were, that they were cheating. They were, they would take our money, but we couldn't work in most of these places, and things like that. At the grocery stores, Safeway, you could spend your money, but again, you couldn't work there. And so that started. We kind of got involved with some things like that here in San Francisco, and later, in other parts of the country. I Because of that, I was uh, I went to the March on Washington, the big one in '63.
Right.
Yeah, I went there. There was a chartered bus of us from the San Francisco area. There were people who had come from Portland, like that, that far away, who were part of our tour. So I was on that first trip. I went, to that first demonstration. And here's something that a lot of people I don't think we got to know. In 20 years later, in '85, there was a second March on Washington, and I know not hardly anybody who knew about it. I happened to have been performing in New York, and I went to that march on Washington. It was much smaller. It was smaller, but there was a substantial amount of participants there. So yeah, I went to that, and something kind of weird happened. Those little pools, in front of the Washington Monument. They're
Right.
little pools of
Yeah.
water.
Right. Reflecting pools.
Well, something happened. It was very warm, when I was there, and I started to feel very nauseous. I don't know why. So I couldn't think of it because of the crowd. I couldn't, so I rolled my pants up and sat on the bank of one of those little pools, and that, and I recovered. I was okay, but I was I was there, and
So,
hardly.
what John is talking about there is so no Northern freedom movement without the Southern movement. The Southern movement really moved us and inspired us, and he was inspired by the Southern movement, heard King speak, and then he was active in the San Francisco freedom movement. And you were arrested at Select Rentals, which was campaign for open housing to see that blacks got and other people of color got listing and housing. And then you were arrested again at the Sheraton Palace and other demonstrations for jobs. So he said that we could go and buy something but couldn't work. And sometimes you couldn't even try the clothes on, just like the South. And so basically, John was on the executive committee at one point. John was a key leader in the San Francisco freedom movement, and with his freedom band raised money for the movement. And that is and I've talked to you about this before, John, the San Francisco freedom movement is the only successful across the board Northern freedom movement, defeated an whole economic power structure, organized 45,000 Black people block by block, built housing for our people, built a united front, led Chinese Americans and Latino Americans, radicalized the white students at UC Berkeley, where you taught music at one point. And that is the premier college university of the world, got more Nobel laureates coming out of there. So we radicalized the strategic center of miseducation in the United States without intending to do it, improvisationally, and gave birth to the experimental college that's a forerunner of Black studies. So you're not only talking to a musician here, but somebody who put his behind on the line. And by the way, he may not look like it, but he's a boxer and a championship boxer by that. Lightweight, wasn't it? Was it lightweight?
Oh, no, I was smaller. I was featherweight. I weighed 127 pounds of fury.
127 pounds of fury. Fast as greased lightning.
Yeah, I boxed for 2 summers. And when I was 14, 15, you can, and that's, and it was my hardest fight, the toughest fight was my first one. I was scared, I was afraid of being punched and hurt, but I won. I hit him many more times than he hit me, but I remembered I had trouble. It hurt to eat because he had hit me on the cheeks several times. And but that was it. After that first fight, I was never afraid of anybody. And I'm blind, I'm blind on my right side. I was born blind, and I boxing, and I became, aware of my problem. Had I lost sight in the other eye, so I knew to quit, and I didn't like hurting people. It's not in my spirit to,
you're a nice guy. Nobody would expect that you're a boxer, not just because of your size, but because of your disposition, until they turn you wrong, because there's a Texas side to you. Now, when they turn you wrong, it's a different story.
That's different. I went to school in other parts of, never lived for a very short time, coming from LA for about 3 months. I lived near school, and we always went to African American schools, by the way, in Dallas, because we were not integrated. But I lived in white districts, and the last 3 years, it was a long week. We had to push about 3 buses to go to school, and we went to school with adults going to work from, all white folks, my sister and I. And that's how at my last 3 years. And before that, as young as 3 years old, we lived in Highland Park. And there are people who became known in this area whom I known as a child, as a little boy, a baby, practically 3 years old, who became very well known in the Pacific area here, whose names I won't mention, but I grew up with mostly Caucasians until most of my life, even here in Oakland, playing with musicians of different cultures and races. That's what I'm, yeah. And my bands are always, by the way, were almost always mixed too, because I grew up with everybody most of my life, and it didn't change when I was became a professional band leader. And,
Yeah,
and
that's true of me as well. And I often wondered why. And why did I? Because I believe I come out of a system that says you pick your destiny in heaven in the presence of God. So I often wondered, why in the hell would I pick San Francisco? There's so few black people. And then I realized later, it's the microcosm of the United States. And if you can crack this nut, you can crack America. And that's
yeah,
literally, that's why I have not moved out of this Bay Area, because it's a nice classroom for looking at the microcosm of the macrocosm. Because you know me, I'm a revolutionary. So I'm looking at how can I apply all this stuff to deconstruct this stuff and create something better. So it's San Francisco Freedom Movement was a giant classroom for that. I didn't know that in the beginning, but I discovered it later. And it's really good just as a boxer, when you knock out your opponent or beat him, it's good when you're engaged in political struggle and you kick the behinds of the biggest, most powerful institutions on the planet on behalf of your people. You learn something. And I didn't know that was my thing. So your contribution was very important. By the way, did you see any influence that being involved in the movement had on your music?
to be honest, musically, I didn't, that, I forgot almost from time to time. I was so involved with demonstrating and that most people, and including myself, I forgot I was a musician for a while. And it was not until I started to think of yeah, I'm a musician. So that's when I eventually developed the Freedom Band, which did we played and raised a few funds for the civil rights movement, and I had everybody in, all kinds of music shows, and I went to school with everybody, and it's reflected in the personnel that I chose as I became known as John Handy, the composer, musician, and I've always had everybody, as many people and cultures as I could put in a small group, and I've had groups of all kinds of all sizes, that included uh, usually small numbers of players, but I've had as many as 15, 20. I had a woman's band, but where I was only male, of about 11 women, and then I was only male. Then men were really pushed to get in. I finally had to integrate it because I could see men really wanted to come in, and
And you had a band of people who played violin, sisters who played violin.
that came a little later. I had a group of three sisters, sometimes four, uh, uh, and, uh, uh, and and African Americans, and then I did, I had bands that had uh, Caucasians in the band and Latinos. That was called John Handy with Class, and when I didn't have them, it was John Handy without no class. we, I named them that because I wanted to get, I wanted them to dress, even with an evening apparel, and we did that for a while. We did it for a while, and we stayed together off and on for 23 years. We were
Wow.
we we played New York, Village Vanguard, uh, uh, Pennsylvania universities. We played a number of those, throughout the country. We went to Japan. That's the only foreign country we went to. We played there twice, in Japan, toured there twice in Japan. Uh, and some of them the two of them are still playing. One of them has died. It's, unfortunately. But we had a rhythm section of men mostly, and uh, bass, drums, and piano, and sometimes guitar. And we had a great singer, Buddy Connor, a fine singer. He was with us for quite a while till he passed.
Mm.
And a number of people played with us. Diane Witherspoon, the singer, little girl, little lady. she sometimes suffers. And yeah, I've known people like Mary Stallings, you know, since she was a kid. I
Yeah, right.
remember we were in a big band before, you know, before I went to New York. So I know, you know, I just criticize singers, but some of my inspiration were singers, you know, that I love Sarah and people like that. And apparently some of them were fans. I found out were fans of mine, you know, as a saxophone player. So, um, so all of what I was saying is not to say that singers, you know, it was just to kind of get them, goad them, to push them a little more,
Yeah,
to
right. To be professional, you know.
to become better artists, and
Yeah.
and they will. I'm sure they're
Now,
they so.
John, you're a music historian, and this show draws a lot of younger people of all ages. Because some people have asked me what's young, but 18 on up. And
Mhm.
the younger generation, some of them are into jazz, and even some of the hip hoppers are. But my question to you is just to give people an overall picture of this. Um, we know generally that the African American art form developed out of the spirituals, and I call it the spiritual blues because it was both the spirituals and the blues at the same time. It was political and spiritual, and it had a theme of freedom coded in it. But in the development of jazz, um, how do you describe that history, how it came about, and who are some of the people that brought it into being?
Oh, it goes as far as I'm concerned, as I've learned who some of the early folk who inspired me, that I was delighted to have heard, and I'm sure in this, not only that it inspired me, I learned to imitate some of their singing, and later put on, you know, musically when I finally got an instrument. And people like Sarah Vaughan and Billy Eckstein, you know, he was one of the, and of course I mentioned we had early songs, uh, music with Louis Armstrong when I was a very young child,
Mhm.
and my mom, he was he was a little ahead of her in terms of age, but we had some of his records when I was as young as 7 and 8 years old. I'll be glad when you're dead, you rascal, you.
Mhm.
Fats Waller. We didn't have the recordings, but there was a lot of radio. And since we lived in all white districts, we had nothing else to do. And I wasn't in school until I was 8 years and 7 months. So all those early years, starting at about 3, actually even 3 years old, we had only the radio all day long until uh, Little Orphan Annie came on at about 6 o'clock. And we had Orphan Annie and some of the um, uh, Can You Top This a little later. Those are about 3 comedians. So we have favorite. We learned from. Am I answering your first question? I'm not sure. Is this making sense? That whom I learned and how I learned, and what I think people could do now to learn. I'm not sure what young people are doing because I haven't lived with around young people for a long time. However, I taught at San Francisco State for 18 years for a while, part time, and I left for about 3 years, and I think I came back for another long stretch. I also taught at Stanford, at the University of California. I was there twice, and it's a number of other and internationally. You know, I lectured and gave classes, lectures and demonstrations, that kind of thing. Uh, uh, internet with different bands here and in Europe. And uh, I didn't do any lecturing. I don't believe I recall in Japan. We performed, and
So in this question of the origin, historical origin of blues, you're tracing it back to some of the original innovators and creators of the art form itself. Louis Armstrong being real big, and
Mhm.
Fats Waller, Philly Joe Jones, and Sarah Vaughan and others.
Yeah, they
So,
jumped.
so these were the people who were the innovators and creators of the music that helped shape you and other musicians.
Yeah. By the way, you put in Philly Joe Jones, we jumped way ahead because he was only about 10 years younger than I am, older than I am. Fats
Mm.
Waller, Fats Waller, and people like that, and Duke Ellington were older. Duke Ellington was more like a grandparent. My
Mm.
grandmother was just a little bit older than he, and I got him. But however, um, uh, uh, we start very young generally musically. If you're you if you're going to go into music, I always say start 2 years ago, no matter who you are, and your chances are better if as if you start very young, because when you go into get into classes as a young person and as a young adult and as an older adult, you're let's go back to the younger when you're there's always somebody there who has been playing much longer and know therefore that especially on instruments, you if you're going to play an instrument, don't think you're going to do raise hell when you start at 18 and 20. You need to start as a baby
Mm.
almost, because you there are people there that you'll meet like here and play with, and especially if you play an instrument like mine, where there can be several. When I first started at the university, well, even in grammar school, there were 6 or 7 of us, and then when I got into college, there were I think 14 clarinets,
Mm.
maybe close. Yeah, and I was way in the background because I'd only had a couple of lessons, and you people there many times are being taught, right at a very young age. As young as 5 and 6, especially piano players and violin players. But so if you're going to play a guitar and instruments like that, I don't want to hear anybody tell me, well, I just started and I heard my son, well, he started playing, he was 22. You're not going to do a damn thing at that age with a musical instrument. You got to I said, start playing, in the womb as you can.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah.
That's a really good point. So could you discuss what you see as the relationship between the spirituals and the blues and jazz? What's the relationship?
The difference is are the lyrics. You change God to baby if you're singing the blues.
uh,
It's basically the lyrics, the same notes and the production of the notes, the sounds that you make, and uh, 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 as we refer to it as music. Uh, they're pretty much the same as the spirituals. They became spiritual, and
mm,
the more there are some fantastic blues players and almost everybody that I know of any worth and of what we call soul, playing from the spirit from within, and and basically that's imagination within, and how you're able to produce it and how you hear it. That's what a lot of people, and this isn't putting anybody down necessarily, but they want to play the music, but they don't, and I can understand that they don't want to pay the dues that come with it, and
yeah.
that's why what they play seem to doesn't seem to have any real spirit, and it's hard to. These are things that are inherent ingredients that are with beyond words.
Hmm.
That's why it's hard. You can't tell everybody everything about music and about a feeling, because sometimes I think much of it is beyond words, and it's not because necessarily I have a smaller vocabulary than some folks. I think it's just beyond words. You
Mm.
know, it's you it's from within somehow, and much of that is not expressed in terms of, of vocalizing or articulating. with words. It's inherent. It's deep, and the deeper you go, the less, the more. That's why we have. I think music is a great thing because you can express inner feeling that you can never seem to express vocally or verbally.
Well
It's
put.
yeah.
Well put. Yeah, and dues, like you're saying, it's beyond words because you're bringing up deep spirit stuff. It's coming from your soul. It's coming from the depths of you, and sometimes the ups and downs of life. You're saying being able to pay your dues.
That's
It's doing all that, going through the pain. Sometimes the best stuff comes out of the pain. You know what I mean?
okay. I want to interject here. There were guys that I grew up with who were into drugs, and they call those dudes. I remember meeting a great trombone player here in San Francisco, J.J. Johnson, who was, by the way, another Aquarian. And the I lived in New York, but I was out here, and he was out here, and and somebody introduced me and said he used an expletive. He said, "Well, I know who the so and so is," and he was he was looking right at me when he said it. He said, "And he's very talented." He said, "But he ain't paid no dues." And I didn't know what the hell he was talking about because, you know, you're going to pay some dues no matter who you are, what color you are. If life is not always a pleasant thing
Right.
for you, and I think some of it meant that I hadn't done drugs. I'm right, and I still don't do drugs, and
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons I'm here, and most of them, and I think, are meant not here.
Uh,
Okay, I don't know
uh,
if but there are a lot of people my age, and they were very insulting. They'd say things, you can play, but and they were on heroin and other crazy stuff. And I was insulted. I felt like knocking the hell out of you, but I could see it wouldn't have done any good. And I never pulled a Charles Mingus on any of them. I never beat the hell out of anybody. And people in my band who, there were, uh, one of the things I want to give some hints here about being a band leader. When they start complaining about the music, that's when they want their own band. Almost every time, you know, if they find something wrong with it, get their own damn band. And
uh,
people
well
come in
put.
extra
That's
big,
his signature.
you know, try and find anything wrong, and that includes people like Bobby Hutcherson. He was in my band. Mike White, with whom I went to high school, he was in my band twice, and he helped us to uh, break it up because he was saying things like you act as if he didn't put it in quotes quite this kind of English, but you act like you don't want anybody else to play, and that's not true. I never told him, ever, not once did I ever tell him how long to play or that he played too long, and so I don't know where that came from. However, uh, we had some great moments together. We
Mm.
played great concerts together and some innovative stuff. And uh, I was the first person he told Mike was a little older than I. He was about 4 years older, and was out of school. We were we shared a desk when I first came to McClymonds. We were in the boys' glee club, but I didn't know he played until I was in my late 20s, early 30s, and I ran into him when I was 31 years old. He'd been out of school before I had been. And I gave him his first gig and paid. He said I was the first person that he ever paid him any money. So I gave him his first paying gigs through the years, and we did some wonderful things together. And I played a lot of music because so Mike White could play it. You know, I'm saying that we did the Spanish Lady and stuff like that because he could play it that better than so-called bebop tunes like things that Charlie Parker and uh, he could play modals, things that I learned about long with a while before I went to New York. As a matter of fact, I was in at someone's house during my last rehearsal for my first recording date, Mike Melvoin was a piano player, who's we were, and he came in with the Miles Davis tunes. What is that? That album, da 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 da, All Blues.
Blue, kind of blue.
Yeah, no. That's All Blues. Da 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 da
Yeah,
da.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, by the way, the real truth of the matter on that is Charlie Mingus was doing. We were doing that in Better Get It in Your Soul. That's on the album Mingus own, and the piano part. I've never heard one musician ever make the comment that the piano part is what Miles Davis slowed down, and I had always hoped Charlie Mingus didn't play it as fast as we did because I didn't think it didn't work. It worked fine for a point for recording. A lot of people liked it, including Miles. He used to come and hear us play, and way down and put it in a key that most amateurs, saxophonists or trumpet players could play, not the piano player. In the key of G, it's much easier to play it. We played in the key of F. It's much harder to play. So, and he, that album became, it opened up a lot of things, including modal things, modal music. And I encountered that when I was in Catholic school. We did a lot of Gregorian chants, which are basically modes too.
Now, here's the point. Here's the point. John is pointing out where a major recording of jazz came from. Miles Davis's that came from what they heard in Mingus's group. He just slowed it down. Huh?
Right. If you hear the
I
piano
never
part,
heard no musician say that before.
well, I know, not one of them has ever said anything about that. We play down, da 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 da. You play down, down, down,
Yeah, yeah.
down, down. I used it somewhat in the Spanish lady. That was a big part of the music. No, nobody's heard that yet, and I don't blame them because it's very difficult to to play something like that. Uh, I, so I did it. I was able to do it that
Spanish
way.
lady, you got nominated for a Grammy on that.
Yeah, that one and on the other side, both for that album. The other side is If Only We Knew is the name of a piece that I composed as a student. It just turned into and I got a nomination for Grammy. Duke Ellington beat me out as a composer that year, and Bill Evans for something else. Bill Evans won something, and then I came within I think it was 2 points to tie for album of the year with Ornette Coleman, and Ornette was using his 12-year-old son to play drums, so I rest my case.
By the way,
Yeah.
you have a comment here thanking us for having you on the show, and it's from Sherry Handy. Sherry Handy.
Hey, Sherry. I know who Sherry is. I haven't heard from her for a lot of years. Yeah.
Right
Hey.
right
Yeah. Yeah.
In terms of your playing, could you share with people some of you've shared some of it with me. I don't know how much you want to share here of this, but your experience of playing with people like Charles Mingus, and then your own groups. You talked somewhat about it, but any that you have left out. But playing with Charlie Mingus, he had a beautiful sound. I like the sound of his groups. You know what I mean? But what were some of your experiences in that, and what was your role in his group?
Well, I was on in his band and his group for about 4.5 months, and I had led bands, my own bands here in San Francisco, Oakland. Yeah, San Francisco. I moved there at 19 years old, and it was interesting to a point, but very soon after having played with him, I found him two things. Some of his music was beautiful. Some of it was really bad. It's he would. It's something beautiful, and especially if you commented about it and said it was nice or beautiful, he seemed to do something to it to ruin it. It- yeah, I don't know what it was about him, and there are times that he was, very, like little boy sweet. Other times he was a raving monster, and that's why I couldn't stay in that band for very long. I learned a few things, uh, but I wasn't totally conscious of it at the time. If you have a creative mind musically or artistically of any kind like that, like music, something close to it, you're almost always influenced by something that is unusual. And one of the things he was doing was playing in 6/8 time, which is kind of waltz with the you know 3/4 or 3 or 6/8, and that that was something that I learned. That's when we recorded a tune called "Better Get in Your Soul," and that was the da 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 da, but it was da 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 da, instead of da ba da ba da ba da ba da. That's what, and it made more sense, and it became a classic. It showed a lot of people how to play the blues another way, and yeah, and then he introduced some of the modal things that were as as old as most music that I can imagine. Meaning, before no music notation in Europe or any other place, because music notation didn't just start in Europe with the Europeans. The Indians from India had a system, and there are other systems uh, of notating music, also indicating what you really wanted. Uh, yeah, so I'm not sure about where all of them came from, but I know doggone well that Europeans were not the only ones who notated music. That's not true.
Could you talk a little bit about your $1 million recording and playing of Hard Work?
Okay, let let me back up a little. I'll get to that. Um, my the piece that I really enjoyed was myself, and that was the Spanish Lady when I recorded in 1965 at the Monterey Jazz Festival, and that was and then somewhat later, the reason when I finally got around to things like Hard Work, when I lived in New York, it seems that many of the players, I don't know if artists, painters are like that, because that was originally what I wanted to be. But what if a musician uh, became somewhat successful with a hit record, and generally that meant you made more money, there was more employment for you. You had distractors. You had people who were very uh, uh, they were, I guess, for the lack of a better word, they were jealous. I remember people putting Coltrane down when he started doing those when he left Miles and started doing things for himself. They put Miles down. I remember a name of an alto player from out of Detroit, I believe, guy my age he had this big little guy with the big voice. Coltrane's playing that jungle music, and people were buying his recordings, and this guy, I think he eventually, well, he left New York because I never saw him working anywhere, and he's gone. He's been gone for several years. They put almost everybody down, and I guess I remember Reggie Workman, who was still around when I did Hard Work. uh, he said, he said he he said something to me. I did Hard Work first of all because I wanted to, and I had played albums for one of the Spanish Lady. There on that album. There are only two compositions, one on one side and one on the other, and you get no record play. Record companies can't put commercials on. They can't pay their bills when if they don't have commercials. So yeah, it doesn't get played. As a result, it came out and it was hit, and it was a hit. Some people knew about it, but a lot of people have no idea. They think they only know me with about hard work. So hard work. I wanted to record. I hadn't recorded in 8 years, 8.5 to be exact. And I wanted to play an album that a recording of make an album that would a number of people that may become popular, and that people didn't do like they did at many jazz clubs. They come and they buy one drink and they want to sit there for 4 hours, but you can't pay bills and they can't pay the band with that. So I knew I had a hit. I wrote 2 other tunes in addition to hard work, and I knew it was. I'd done the music, and then I added the hard work. I just something said I'd never really gotten that much into lyrics. So a few little things here. I've got some songs that I like, and that's kind of where I got paid well. And I didn't make that much money. Listen to this. Hard Work is on the same label that John Coltrane was on with all those many of those great recordings he did. And they finally, uh, the record company was a writer, I forgot his name. God, he decided he wanted to do a book on the label that Coltrane had made all those great albums on. And he said he named the book. He named the book the house that Coltrane something train built, something like that. The title. However, I was on the same label, John Coltrane, with all those recordings, those wonderful recordings. And I did hard work because it's the blues. Handy, John Handy, Handy, you know what St. Louis blues with?
Yeah,
I might.
Handy. Right.
And when you name Handy, that's part of the culture. And for us, so many. I noticed when I first moved here, some of the musicians were African American musicians were ashamed to play the blues, so they started singing things like, "All the guys have eyes for Liza," and he's a brother, but Liza has eyes for me. Through the years, and through the years that kind of happened, and they weren't doing really the blues. There was very few people like Charlie Parker did the blues, and he never left them. Dizzy did the blues. Miles did urban blues. He didn't. I think his background might have had something to do with it. He didn't seem to have the problems financially and otherwise that some of them until he got, other people. Some people did things that they shouldn't have done. But where was I? I get lost here. I had a stroke, so
you're doing fine. So you're talking about the award-winning record. Your million record seller, Hard Work, and how you came up with this. Could you just briefly go into, because you appeared at the Monterey Jazz Festival, which is the longest produced jazz festival in the United States. You appeared more than any other musician 11 times and gave the best performance. So could you just speak a little bit about that?
Well, I had a band that was working 6 nights a week. 2 of the guys were Canadian from Canada, from Vancouver. And I had Jerry Hahn, who was a guitar player, and Mike White. So if I must get into this, the band was 3/5 white, and we played Monterey. And here's what happened. when I got the two guys from Canada who were Caucasians, the drummer uh, Terry Clark and the bass player, piano player was Don Thompson. We're still communicating. We were very good friends, and uh, we when we played, let's see, where was I with about Monterey? Um, what did you ask me? Say it again.
Basically, your experience in performing at Monterey
Oh,
and
yeah. Mhm.
11
Um,
times, and just some of what that was about.
okay, we had Ralph Gleason, the jazz critic, heard us. He came in one evening as we were playing at 6 nights a week. So the band was, we were really well, but we had one of us had two of us I think had the flu. And it was Ralph Gleason came in with a guy who was a nightclub owner. I forgot his name. Warren was his name. Anyhow, we I saw them walk in at the club, and we were feeling pretty low, and I think I had a bit of flu, and I told the guys, I said, Ralph Gleason is here, who's the most prominent jazz critic, one of the most prominent ones in the country, and I was basically saying, wake up and let's play. And we played. I called the Spanish Lady, and we played it, and it knocked him out. That's how it started. He
Mhm.
heard it, and he started to. He went to the Jimmy Lyons, who was the manager of the jazz at Monterey Jazz Festival.
Right.
That's how we get into places like that. He and really, one of the things was that I grew up here, and he never wrote about me until I went to New York. He said John Handy went to New York to try his great talent in New York. So I believe, I know it had something to do with it. I had Caucasians in the band who could play, and they could really play. So what happened, this is kind of interesting. The brothers here got mad at me because I had people that had gone out of, I got white guys in the band, and and the white guys got mad because I had white foreigners in the band. So so there was no win in that until they heard us play. And when we played, they knew. They came around because there was nothing like it, including uh, a lot of folks that we mentioned earlier. It was totally unique, and uh, we reinvented, the violin and the jazz. There were other people who played earlier, of course, and I even sat in with Stuff Smith years earlier, when I was much younger. And Mike White became what he did. He was a very gifted violin player, and we did lots of music together. And I missed him when we weren't playing together. He died fairly recently,
Mhm.
and yeah, I still remember some of those highlights, great highlights. Monterey was one. We got 4 standing ovations. I'll put it that way.
That's a
Yeah,
big deal. I'm going to Monterey next month, and that's a big deal because you've got jazz connoisseurs there. So when they
yeah.
stand up and give you that, then that means there's something really exceptional going on. Now I got two more questions, and we'll wrap up. This has really been
Let me talk
a mag-
about something. Hang on a minute.
okay.
Something happened in Monterey.
Okay.
Um, the year earlier, the year 50, 57. No, I think it was 57. Uh, we played, I'm sorry, it was 64. Mingus called me and asked me to, he was going to play Monterey that year. And he asked me to play with him. And I didn't never wanted to play with him again. We had differences in attitudes and stuff. And however, I had never played Monterey. He wanted me to play tenor saxophone because he said Booker Irving couldn't come, who was in the band when I was in it. And so I wanted to play, so I played tenor, and something happened. I won't go through the. Uh, Mingus didn't give me a feature. That's the only reason I took it. He was supposedly going to give me a one tune with his great band. He had Charles McPherson and Ronnie Hilliard on trumpet and alto saxophone, and Jackie Byard Danny Richmond, of course, on drums, Jackie Barrett, piano player. And he didn't give me the feature.
Mm.
He lied, and we even rehearsed it. And so what happened is, I think what had happened is, I told the truth I had a conversation with somebody, and it involved Charles, and I never lied about it. And Charles was wrong and did something wrong, and especially when I was in the band, or to me, I we never had any, he never socked me in the mouth like he did Jackie McLean. I'm glad he didn't. That's he lived longer, and he he uh, he didn't feature me. So all right, he had a great year. That last piece he played, I was so happy because it was a fantastic piece when we played that year. I was happy for him. However, I was hired the next year for my own band, and we went on ahead of him, 4 standing ovations, and Charlie had to follow us. And I don't know if this disarmed him, but Charles came out and he embarrassed his band by having them march out. They'd never done that. They were playing When the Saints Go Marching In, which they hadn't planned to play. And for being embarrassed, and especially after having to follow me, but most people didn't know what had happened in the audience. He had lied to me and didn't give me a feature, and he had to follow me after the Spanish lady. Okay.
It's kind of like spiritual revenge unintended. Now there's two other areas I want to go into. I really appreciate it. This has been some profound stuff, I think, that people are getting here. So one is, you're not only a musician or songwriter, you're a composer. Could you explain what it means to be a composer? What does that involve, and a little bit of your experience in composing?
Okay, well, I started trying to write when I was about 13 or 14, and I was somewhat influenced. I'd heard Dizzy Gillespie's one bass hit, and I remembered I was discouraged because he had something in there called, let's see, augmented scale, and it stopped me because I didn't know what the hell it was, and my composing stopped at 14, and I didn't try again until I was 18, and I didn't finish that either. I was actually about 20, in my early 20s, 24, so before I finished a piece all together. I did mostly improvisation, and I had learned in Korea where I was there. I was in special service for a minute, and we had a Japanese piano that didn't have the strings weren't working; they're all broken. So I took twine, and string, and I fixed it so it would play. And we actually had USO shows. People came, and actually touring used that piano. So on that piano, I was alone quite a bit. I was learning about chords and things, and somehow I learned what scales and what all this stuff meant. And that was where my composing came in. I learned.
We got some stuff on the site you need to take down. Go ahead, keep talking.
Okay. So from the experience of being in Korea, I learned about chords. I learned about composing. It just came to me through all the years that, as a kid with my best friend who was in high school, Henry Browning, with me. We were saxophone players to begin with, and we talked a lot about piano, and there's a couple of the people like William Kinsey, who was a trumpet player. They all have been gone a long time, and so that's what my composing came to me that way. I started putting things together, and I realized I could read music and I could write music, and so I started writing, and I finally put something together, and it's a sweet piece, and it was pretty easy. I could do blues. I knew blues, and I could notate, and I had pretty good penmanship, so I liked it. I wanted to be a writer. I mean, an artist, so I learned how to write my music writing was better, a little better than legible. It was actually kind of nice.
Mhm.
And
Hmm.
mm,
Yeah, that's a well-rounded kind of mastery, you know. Um, the training you have, your own development of yourself as a child, as a musician, and then also being able to compose and up to 100 instruments. You know what I mean?
let me say something quickly here, Bill. Let me insert. I played in bands, concert bands, from the 6th grade all the way until through college. After college and back, I went to college off and on until I was 30. So I played in lots of concert bands, and I heard what through all those years I listened to what the other instruments were doing and what they sounded like. So when I started to write, it was first for concert band. I wrote a piece, but I think we had about 70 pieces, and I had learned. I had taken music uh, uh, composing. I knew a lot about theory. I didn't really take theory classes because I taught myself theory. I went into composing through Hindemith, that went through that that composer for learning to write in that uh, style, and then learning how to uh, 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 to how to look at a score and understand what was going on. And I saw a few music. I took a music class my first year of college. Outside of it was jazz arranging and stuff, and I never wrote anything. I never turned anything in. But I never missed a class. I always went to class no matter where. I
Mm,
didn't turn things in on time. I turned them
mm,
in late, but I was always there.
mhm, mm,
I never, I didn't miss classes. No, go
mm.
to school. If you're going to go to school and stay there and learn something.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Mhm.
Discipline's key. Now, this is the final piece here. In terms of just the overall view of the music, um, give me a little insight into what you think Dizzy, Coltrane, and Louis Armstrong contributed. You know, just a little.
Oh, okay. Well, Louis Armstrong, was within the first water of learning, playing, putting the music together, uh, 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 with using his imagination and his ability to create music at the state that he was in the maturity that he was at that point, with all of his whatever his experiences were, and he was able to improvise. In other words, play things that he heard that were inside him in his mind, um, and it was so different. And there were people a little older than he who were out there before Bunk Johnson and later with who was that? Went to Chicago with Lewis. I'm not as much of a student of some of the music of that generation. It really came to me during the Bob era. I'm younger than Charlie Parker and those guys, Dizzy and those. But what they did is they went through, came out of people like Art Tatum, Lester Young, Teddy Wilson. Uh, it was a gradually everybody, all of these people contributed something, when others came along, like people younger than I, they they discover something a little different. At this point, I'm learning things that developments of in some of my own curiosity. I'm learning about the saxophone. I'm learning a lot about some of the things that I played. I wrote some things as early as let's see, um, when did my first album, and uh, it was it was taking those some of the things that Turing did and Dizzy Gillespie did, etc. It didn't start with them. Even hearing Lester Young, it's amazing what he was doing. And after that, and Ben Webster like that, what he was teaching when he played. if you've got any kind of talent and curiosity, my wife loves, she hears more than a lot of musicians I know. She listens. She's been listening since she was a young girl, and it's amazing what she hears and appreciates. And I think more people can do this if they will listen to the doggone music and don't listen just to the lyrics. Lyrics, I love lyrics, even they're good lyrics, but most of it is very juvenile. And even when some of us are much older and we are nostalgic about some songs, most of those songs there's so much more music in the songs that unfortunately singers do not bring to fore. They do. You don't hear it. It's not, and they sing, especially the people of European descent in the earlier ones. They sing exactly what the composer did. Well, the composer, that was all he did for. And some of that stuff is almost putrid. So, and some was great. There were some geniuses, but then there were some real bad ones too. And we inherited that. There were master musicians, not just in Europe, but some here, and in this country and other countries. But we taught them a lot with improvisation. We didn't improvisation, but we developed it more than anybody else. And some people want to say they did too, but no, they basically learned from us. They're not going to get away with that. I know better. I taught them.
No, the European, because of the nature, particularly the ones that first started this, the British, Anglo-Saxon Protestant, they brought their culture here, dropped it here, and that included their music, and they invented nothing new here. And basically what they brought was very oppressive, because whether it's their political system, which is divide and conquer to gain power for a very few, their military system, which is to outshoot you and exterminate Native Americans and whatnot. But they brought, or their judicial system that's just a mouthpiece for the people that run the country. So they brought England here, and then a few other Europeans brought theirs, but they didn't create anything new here. They didn't create anything new, and they couldn't create art, because if you're in the business of slavery and murder and stealing land, that is not exactly going to inspire beauty. You know what I mean? So our stuff, and Native American, and there are other people of color, who brought in stuff, but our stuff is at the foundation. And I said this to you. I think that because when we came here, there was an effort to wipe our culture out, from after when we came here, there was an effort to wipe it out. Whereas in the Caribbean, because they were the overwhelming majority, African culture just continued without effort. So here we had to go into a creative thing to recreate it and continue it. And as a result, creativity is in our bone marrow. We can't help it. And it's not because we were more creative when we came here. The circumstances required, and you say it's an African legacy.
It's in the DNA.
Huh?
It's in the DNA.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's in the DNA. It's as deeper than, it's as deep as you can get. And other people could have that. I think life might have been much harder for some people after they left Africa. The people, I think it might have helped to create the bitterness and the hatred and the jealousy of why some of us are treated, with such disdain.
Well put.
Yeah. Yes.
That insight you have there, by the way, is the same one George Washington Carver had, the greatest scientist in the 20th century, probably the 21st. He said that underneath this racism that comes from whites is a deep sense of inferiority. And that deep sense of inferiority, I think, goes back to the first contact with African people and people of color who had achieved so much more than them. And then this African in America who gets ground into the dust at the same time, has nothing but dignity and humanity and beauty in them and creativity. Look at this telescope that they just put up to monitor all these galaxies. A brother did it. Look at the people who managed the project because it
How
couldn't
about
go
NASA?
anywhere. It was a
How about
brother who
NASA?
did it.
How
And he
about
came out of a
NASA?
black college, a mathematician, and a person with technical engineering skills, but who's good with people.
Yeah.
He
How about,
downplayed his technical skills to make it work. Huh?
how about those sisters who helped with NASA? The black.
Hey.
I never heard about that until recently.
Yeah. I mean, so good that one of the astronauts that was going up, a prominent one, said he wasn't going up until she fact checks it in her own head. He didn't
That's
think the computer was as smart as she was, and he was right.
right.
Huh?
They're
That's
out of
us.
just.
And
They're,
jazz is at the peak of that. And another thing I really stress, because of the way in which enslavement worked here, and they moved against the drum, so our music, both our singing and instrumental music, became uppermost, but the drum continued because in the spirituals, your whole body was polyrhythmic instrument. But the thing is, as a result of that, then this art form, which has this music foundation, becomes the foundation for everything else. And then it influences all areas of life. So if you have a writer, a Toni Morrison, she's a jazz writer, or
yep.
if you have a Ralph Ellison, a jazz, writer.
Mhm.
Or you got some who are coming out of the blues, Richard Wright, because he came out of Mississippi. What else could you have but the blues? You come out of Mississippi. But it's the positive blues. It ain't all the moaning and groaning blues.
African American, how could you come out of Mississippi as an African American and not have the blues?
Yeah, you better believe it. Malcolm X, he was a complex thinker,
Yeah.
jazz thinker. Martin Luther King, he was one of these magnificent, poetic, beautiful, he's in the sing-song style of Africa, gospel blues. You know what I mean? So the
Yeah.
music inspires all domains of creativity. Look at George Washington Carver. He
Yeah.
considered himself an artistic scientist. And because he was in Kansas, they didn't have the instruments that blacks normally play. So he played an accordion. But he was also a singer. He was so good, he got a scholarship to the foremost academy of music in the country. And then he was a painter. And what did he paint? He painted pictures of plants because that was really his drive. And then
Wow.
he was an
Yeah.
artistic scientist. He innovated so much you can't count it. Einstein said he was second in the world. Hell no. He was not only first, because you can't count the number of innovations. Why? Because he did like Coltrane. After he cold turkey got off drugs and alcohol, he had a dream. It was a sound from heaven. That became the drowning sound of a love supreme. And what happens with George Washington Carver? He is piping in. He said, I'm thinking God's thoughts. He would get up at 4 a.m, go into a room where he did creative science. He called it creative science, but he would go by himself. And that was why he was so good. That spiritual thing that you talked about that left the European, because there was a time when they had it, but then they lost it. And there's a whole reason for that. So the thing is, this is not only our whole card, it is the key to the salvation and freedom of this country. It is the key to the salvation and freedom of the planet, not just us, but any people who pipe into this, but especially us. So with you, brother, you're a magnificent representative of this. I really love you. I love you because you're just a nice person. And then, of course, I love your creativity, but you're a really nice person. And you've done so much that you contributed to our people, to our culture, and to our struggle for liberation. To me, it's an honor to know you. You know what I mean? And your wife. It's an honor to know you,
We love you too. We go back a while.
Yeah, we sure do. Yeah,
Well,
and music is the sound of heaven, good music, because God is a vibratory force, infinite force. And so when you're piping, you were making this point before about the music. When you pipe into that, You're into God's talk when you're doing the right talk, because there's some music ain't no good. And
I
God's got
agree.
such a powerful mind. God has an appreciation of stuff none of us have, because God has attunement to this, because God created this. They say Pythagoras, who was a Greek who went through the mystery systems of Kemet, Pythagoras, and was in there for 20 years. He said he was taught by the Kemites, the Egyptians, that the planets emit music. It's of such a high frequency, only a very, very delicate ear could hear it. And so this field that you're in is the top of God's field. It's the top of God's field. Beauty, vibratory sounds that are healing. I know you've done a lot of that for people, and I know a lot of people have done that for you. So
it's wonderful through the years of us off, and I've run into couples who are married because they came to see me, and it was my music, they said, that attracted them. And they got married because of coming to a John Handy concert.
right on, right on. Ain't that
Yeah,
beautiful? Right
that's
on.
fantastically beautiful. Yeah. Well, anyhow,
So that's it. Hold on for 1 second. We have some comments here. There might be 1 or 2 questions and we're finished. But I want to thank you, John. But let's see if there's anything up here that Loud to Zoo. Question to you, John. Have you explored other disciplines, for example, painting or any other artistic areas?
I told you when I was a child, I wanted to, and I made toys. I what do you carved? I've got a few scars from carving, cutting my fingers, and I wanted to be a carpenter, and I made things in LA when the short time I was there. Yes, I would, if I could very well have been a carpenter. I still, I'm still enthralled with the creative work that people like carpenters do. My daughter is one of my daughters. Is my oldest daughter is an architect.
Wow.
She graduated as an architect. She's became a mother though. She has children. A lot of.
That sounds right. And music is architecture.
It is architectural. It's all part of that of creative ebb. And I wish everybody good luck and keep playing and recreating good music. I have to tell you this quickly. Art Tatum played, he sat in on I almost had a heart attack when I looked around, and he was at the piano, and I heard he made a run, it cascaded. It sounded like a big zipper, and it was so fast. And I wanted to get down. Frank Foster was on the bandstand, both of us. And I started to quit, but I was playing a ballad, and I decided, oh, that's very bad. I was 18, and 20, okay. And I finished "You Go to My Head," I think was the song, and I was not that very familiar with it. But I had breakfast with him after that was over, and and of course, he saw me with books. I was first year of college, and he said, "Oh, are you going to school?" He said, "Yeah." He'd seen me on the bandstand, of course. He said, "Well," he asked me how old I was. Well, he said, "I have a son that age." I was just made 20, and so I asked him about technique. He had such fantastic technique that it was miraculous. And he said, the thing about technique is if you play fast enough, nobody knows what you're playing. and he said, as we were leaving, and I started to go to catch my bus, bus, and then trolley. He said, "Well, young man, if I have any advice to give you about music," he said, "if you're going to be a musician, be the best." Well, I'm too lazy to be the best. I'm going to tell you something very quickly that I learned from boxing. As a youngster, I was a total amateur, but I was good. But I started hearing rumors that I was a dirty fighter. I didn't even know what dirty was. I already knew how to put my Duke stuff. I just learned that somebody did something to me, I did it to them better. You
Yeah.
know, I learned while I was boxing. And so, in other words, I learned there that if you're becoming the best, there are always people, you know, criticizing and coming after you. And so from that, I decided that in music, I won't say never. Um, I didn't want to go through, I didn't want to treat my music like that. I love it too much. I don't want to think of it as competitive, but I'm very competitive if I have to be. And that's why musically, if I have to do that, I know how to do that. You know, I know how to cut heads musically. And I grew up in jam sessions. Okay. But that's what it is about music. I didn't want to bring that into music, but I still am. I can be competitive, but I don't like it. I prefer, you know, a softer approach.
Yeah.
No, yeah,
Right.
okay.
Final one, we're finished. A question here is, what's your view of Jimi Hendrix as a model or master musician?
I think we got much better people. I don't know, you know, it's if you're going to play no more guitar than that, you know, and he was innovative, but play, you know, don't go into that. Learn how to play the instrument, you know, really play it. And especially if you're going to sing. In addition to, yeah, if you're going to sing, he was very talented and very gifted. Don't be Jimi Hendrix even, because if there's any over, Jimi Hendrix was dead, I think, at 27. I think it was the same year that the girl who lived right down the street from me, what was her name, white girl, uh, she sang, and she was, you know, everybody knows that she was from San Francisco. You know, we all know her. She was, you know, kind of earthy, very earthy.
Well,
Janet,
Janis Joplin.
yeah, I think that she used to live just like just across, basically on the same side of the street in the next block, and you know, yeah. Anyhow, I think they died both at 27 years old. Don't even, you know, play another instrument if you think that will inspire you. Don't
Yeah,
be a
that acid and everything else is going to do you in. You know what I mean?
just you know, it
Change the
scares.
music too. You know? Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so John, I'll let you go. I really appreciate this. This was beautiful. I think that if people dig into this, they're going to see some gold mines here because you're dealing with the depths and, you know, the heights. So this
Thank
was
you.
really enjoyable for me.
I appreciate what you've done for the country, for the people, and everybody knows what I'm talking about, whom I'm talking about. You know, and that means everybody. You don't have to be African American to benefit from uh, people like the Shaka. You,
Or
you,
John Handy,
you know,
especially, you know what I mean? And by the way, people who are listening, make a donation. You've got the thing down here. And also subscribe, and watch the Happy channel, HAPI. We did an interview with Happy about August the 4th, the day of my birthday. So, John, this has been wonderful, great, out of sight. Thanks,
thank
brother.
you. I've enjoyed it, and I've gotten, you know, I'm learning every time we talk. Okay,
Same
so
here. Same here. And we've been talking a lot lately.
right,
Right
right.
on. Okay. Now go
Take
enjoy
care.
whatever food your wife has cooked up for you or
I'm
is going
going
to cook up for you.
now.
Huh?
She's a great cook. Yeah, yeah, and a great person, and she loves the music,
Right
and a
on.
great, so uh, and of course educator.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. His
well,
wife was president of City College of San Francisco. You know.
which by the way had the largest enrollment of any school of higher learning in the country. Most people don't
Wow.
know that.
Wow.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
about 95,000 students.
Wow.
Okay.
Well, a smart black man has him a brilliant black woman. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Thank
And
you.
they know it too.
Likewise, and say hello to your wonderful,
Right on.
and beautiful.
I will. I will.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, John.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.